Welcome to a journey through one of the most unsettling chapters in Appalachian lore. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from right now, because this account is likely to move you in ways few stories can. We're about to descend into a generational mystery, buried deep in West Virginia's mountains, where a pair of twin sisters defied every social norm and left behind a legacy so shadowed that even history books chose to leave their names unwritten. The year was 1932. The Great Depression strangled the United States with invisible fingers, crushing hopes and dragging entire households into the pit of poverty. In the high country of Appalachia, conditions were even more desperate. There, between mist-veiled ridgelines and valleys so deep the sun barely skimmed them, communities lived almost completely cut off from the outside world. No paved road stitched these hamlets to larger towns. Tracks were mud for months on end, and any trip meant days of walking or a wagon creaking behind exhausted mules. West Virginia has always been a place of iron-willed people, tempered by coal dust and subsistence fields. The mountains keep secrets unmatched anywhere else in America. There are caverns never fully mapped, gorges where echoes never return, forests so thick that even noon looks like twilight. In this landscape came Ruth and Ruby, twin sisters fated to become a dark legend, whispered in taverns and around campfires for decades. They were born in McDowell County, a place of deep mines and a people trained early to survive on almost nothing. The year was 1914. Europe's Great War had just begun to bleed the old world. But out here, in those far slopes, the outside world seemed to sit in some other dimension. The twins were raised in a rough-hewn cabin near a foaming stream tumbling down from the heights. Their father labored in the mines, as did nearly all the men. Their mother tended a small garden and a few animals, the bare minimum that kept hunger at the door. From childhood, Ruth and Ruby marked themselves as unlike the other girls nearby. While local girls learned embroidery, cooking, and to ready themselves for early marriages and young families, the twins preferred to roam the mountain paths, exploring places the locals avoided. Neighbors said there was something in their eyes, a strange brightness, a focused intensity that unsettled folks. They weren't talkative, but when they spoke, their words carried an unnerving weight. By the time they turned 18 in 1932, the sisters had taken on almost mythic stature in those parts. Rumors coiled around them. Whispers passed mouth to ear on frosty nights. People said they knew every hidden track, every secret cavern, each shortcut that shaved days off the journey. Others swore they shared a near-supernatural bond, communicating without sound, sensing danger in the other even from miles away. Then came the darker talk. Travelers started to go missing. Not many, 3 or 4 a year, but enough to form a troubling pattern. They were always outsiders, folks unfamiliar with these hills who strayed from the main trails, itinerant sellers, men seeking mine work, wanderers with no fixed home. Some believed the mountains simply swallowed them. Accidents, a misstep into a ravine, a sudden storm. Others began to eye the twins with suspicion. The McDowell County sheriff then was William Hargrove, a war veteran who returned with a bad leg and tired eyes. He knew every family and the secrets the mountains tried to hide. William recognized the twins were different, but different isn't the same as guilty. He needed proof, hard proof, and in Appalachia proof could be rarer than gold. In May 1933, a cloth peddler named Thomas Whitmore vanished. He traveled a regular circuit out of Charleston, hauling goods to scattered ridge communities. Thomas was a creature of habit, stopping at the same stops, known for fairness. When he failed to reach Welch, the town where he normally spent the third week's night, folks worried. 3 days later, his horse turned up wandering alone on a trail not far from where Ruth and Ruby were often spotted. Sheriff Hargrove organized a search. He gathered 20 men, some with dogs, others with lanterns and rope. They swept the hills near where the horse had been found. Spring rains had churned the ground into slick clay. Footing was treacherous. After 5 days, they discovered some of Thomas's things near a rock outcrop, locals called Raven Rock. Shreds of torn fabric, an emptied leather bag, but no sign of the trader. Then a hunter spoke up, Edmund Price, a taciturn man with a trustworthy name. He swore he'd seen Ruth and Ruby talking with a man who looked like Thomas at a junction a few miles from Raven Rock. Odd, he said, because the twins rarely chatted with strangers. Yet there they seemed cordial, even friendly. The sheriff decided to question them. He rode to the family cabin with 2 deputies. The place looked more worn than he remembered. Loose siding, a roof patched with tarps. The twins greeted them on the porch, indistinguishable in face but with something in their gaze that chilled even seasoned men. They denied meeting any trader. They said they'd been hunting that day, rabbits and squirrel. There was no way to prove otherwise. Hargrove's inquiry ran headlong into something he knew all too well: mountain silence. In Appalachian hollers, an unwritten code of mutual protection runs deep, a bone-deep distrust of distant authority, even with suspicions. Stewing, rumors traded in taverns and on front. Stoops, getting someone to swear official testimony was near impossible. People feared retaliation, feared becoming the next name, feared breaking family ties woven through generations out here. William wasn't foolish. He knew Ruth and Ruby belonged to a long-rooted family, poor as they were, connected through their father's mine crew. Miners formed a brotherhood, bound by daily danger underground, accusing. A miner's daughters without solid evidence could light fires the sheriff wasn't ready to fight, especially where the law's presence felt faint in these forgotten corners. Still, William persisted. He combed older files, cases dismissed as accidents or chalked up to men who moved on and never returned. In the dust-furred archives, wooden boxes downstairs, damp air smelling of mold and old ink, he found records back to 1928. At least 9 disappearances clustered near trails the twins were known to frequent. 9 in 5 years, all lone travelers, all from elsewhere. None with close kin pushing for answers. The pattern was chilling. The vanishings always fell between April and October, when trails were passable and visitors braved the hills. Winters, when snow and ice sealed the passes, showed no cases. That suggested something more than nature's hazards. Winter could be deadlier after all. Yet in the cold season, no one simply vanished without a trace. William chose an unconventional path. Instead of confronting the twins again, he watched quietly. He asked Edmund, the hunter who'd seen them with Whitmore, to shadow their movements. Edmund knew these ridges like his own lines, moved quiet as a bobcat, red sign most men missed. For weeks he followed at a distance, noting times and paths, where they lingered, when they vanished and reappeared. What he learned was both mesmerizing and unnerving. The sisters kept an almost ritual routine. They left before first light, while the fog still draped the hollows like a ghostly sheet. They avoided the main tracks, slipping along side paths. They stopped at particular spots, places that seemed to hold meaning. One was a natural cave on the north face of Mount Pinnacle, a dark sentinel over the land. Edmund never dared approach too close. The twins were preternaturally alert, heads snapping at the faintest noise, freezing like deer at the scent of danger. He saw them carry canvas sacks into the cave and come out hours later, bags seemingly emptied. What were they stowing? What lay in those cold depths? In August 1933, another disappearance shook the region. This time it was a young surveyor, Marcus Peton, mapping mine prospects for a Charleston firm. 23. Meticulous, a man who always filed precise reports. When his dispatches stopped, the company sent 2 men to look. They found his camp deserted. Gear scattered as if he'd fled. A cracked compass, torn maps. Notes half-charred in a dying fire. Violence hung in the scene, signs of struggle. One investigator, a war veteran, recognized it instantly. This was no accident. Something terrible had happened. Sheriff Hargrove was called again. He arrived with 6 deputies, resolve renewed. The sight unsettled them. Among Marcus's belongings lay a field journal. His final entries raised every hair. He'd met 2 identical women who offered to guide him into difficult reaches. He described their uncanny feel for the terrain, shortcuts that shaved days. The last entry, 3 days before the camp was found, read, "The sisters invited me to a cave, say it holds astounding rock formations. Few know it. We leave at dawn. I can finally map Mount Pinnacle's northern region accurately. Then nothing. Blank pages. Silence. Now Hargrove had something concrete. The journal tied Ruth and Ruby to Marcus's disappearance. But proof of what happened still eluded him. He knew he had to enter that cave and see for himself. Doing it unprepared would be madness. Appalachian caves are killer mazes. Deep shafts hidden in pinch points that crush passageways. Pockets of bad air pooling without warning. The sheriff recruited 3 veteran miners, men used to confined rock, able to spot danger and thread tight spaces. They packed extra lamps, stout ropes, and sidearms for each. They didn't know what they'd find, but they planned for the worst. Edmund guided them to the Pinnacle cave mouth, relying on his intimate map of the hills and the twins' habits. They left on a September morning as autumn brushed the leaves red and gold. The air a bit cold and clean. Mist hung between oak and pine trunks, ghostlight in the dim. Reaching Pinnacle took 4 hours, climbing steep faces where roots and rock were the only holds. They kept quiet, trading gestures, listening for any sign the twins were near. The cave mouth was nearly invisible, tucked behind brush and a natural vestibule of stone. Without Edmund's finger pointing the spot, they'd have walked past the dark opening into the mountain's gut. William clicked on his lamp and motioned the others in. Inside, damp and cold. Limestone walls glimmered under the beams. Water dripped in uneven ticks, a rhythm that echoed unsettlingly. They moved slowly. Shadows jittered on uneven stone. The smell was wet earth, laced with something else, an odor the miners recognized but didn't name. The first passage allowed 2 abreast, but it pinched soon, forcing single file. The roof dropped, making them duck, then crouch. Hargrove felt the mountain's weight, tons of stone pressing the air thin. He wasn't claustrophobic, but in that squeeze of darkness beyond the small pools of light, even a steady man felt panic pouring at his mind. He breathed, steadied, pushed on. The miners looked at home but kept their faces grave. After 30 grueling minutes, the tunnel yawned into a vast chamber. The roof rose into darkness beyond the reach of their lamps, vast and oppressive at once. Stalactites hung like stone spears, some nearly kissing the floor where stalagmites rose in strange teeth. Water murmured somewhere nearby, the constant drip and trickle filling the silence. Then signs of people. Old fire marks smudged the floor, blackened rings of stones around long-dead embers. Torn cloth scattered throughout, some rotted, others still recognizable as travelers' wear. One miner lifted a moldy leather boot, the kind traders wore over long miles. William swept his beam up a chamber wall. Scratches scored the stone, deliberate. Not letters he knew, but symbols and primitive figures, pairs of human shapes always in twos, connected by lines that hinted at a bond. Between them, mountains, caverns, or something more abstract that resisted rational reading. Edmund, holding rear watch near the entrance, hissed for the others. He'd found something that made even him step back. In a shallow basin, tucked behind a rock spur, lay a hoard of personal items. Empty wallets, rusted pocket watches, rings and chains, coat buttons, knives, eyeglasses with cracked lenses. A macabre collection. Trophies laid aside as mementos of something dreadful. Hargrove's gut turned. Here was the tangible proof, the cave linked to the disappearances. More disturbing was the careful order. The arrangement had deliberate care, as if part of a rite only the sisters fully grasped. This wasn't chaotic violence, but a cold, repeated pattern. One miner, Joseph Carter, underground since 15, pointed to a low side passage in the far wall, barely visible. A faint draft breathed from it, hinting at deeper chambers or another exit. And carrying sound far into the network, William decided. 2 men would stay, guard the entrance and catalog evidence. He would take Joseph and another miner to explore the side tunnel. Edmund insisted on going. He knew the twins' rhythms and could anticipate them. William agreed, and the 4 prepared to crawl deeper into the mountain's bowels. The sideway narrowed, forcing them to belly crawl in places, pushing their lamps ahead, elbows scraping damp, rough stone. The air thinned, pressure built in their ears. Joseph whispered they were descending along a natural fault. He warned of gases that collect unseen and kill without a sound. After what felt like an eternity, the tight passage opened to another chamber, smaller but strikingly different. The floor was uneven, littered with loose rocks that threatened footing. But the center held their attention, a man-made structure, an altar, carefully stacked stones forming a 3-foot platform. Upon it, objects unlike the trophies, scraps of stained cloth, small animal bones, twisted twigs arranged in geometric patterns, and at the center, a dark, leather-bound book so aged the pages seemed ready to crumble. Hargrove lifted it like it might explode. The paper was crowded with faded ink and ornate handwriting, parts legible, parts impossible. Some English, some in scripts he didn't recognize. Margins filled with drawings, humans in pairs, always twins, ringed by the same symbols carved in the first chamber. Some pages read like logs, dates, names, brief notes. With trembling hands, William searched for something he could carry into court. He found a 1928 entry bearing a familiar name, Henry Aldridge, a hardware salesman who vanished that year. Beside it, taken to sanctuary. The mountain accepts. We are keepers of the covenant. Other pages match names from the county files. Marcus Peton appeared under August 1933 with the chilling note, "What maps will be mapped? The mountain claims its secrets." Joseph, peering into the altar's crevices, pried out a smaller, newer journal. He handed it to the sheriff. This one was different. Modern English, clearly written, the same hand shifting subtly between entries, 2 versions of one script. William realized each twin wrote on alternating days, a joint account of thoughts and deeds. The most recent passages carried a terrifying calm. Ruth wrote of weather, plants along the paths, a deer drinking at dawn. Ruby wrote of dreams, mountains breathing, stones whispering secrets in forgotten tongues. Between such everyday details lay oblique references to visitors, those who come from outside, chosen by the mountain. Hargrove kept reading, fascination wrestling dread. A June entry from Ruby said, "The mountain chose us before birth. Mother always knew but feared to speak. She told us of grandmother and great-grandmother, of all the twins before, always 2, always guardians. We did not choose, the path chose us. To refuse would betray the blood." This hinted at more than isolated killings, something handed down, a line stretched across decades, maybe centuries. Edmund paced, glancing back to the tunnel they'd used. The twins frequented these chambers. They might arrive at any moment. In this labyrinth, where Ruth and Ruby had every advantage, surprise could be fatal. He urged they take the books and go. But William pushed onward. Another passage led off the second chamber, narrower. Joseph tested the opening. Air felt different, wetter with a strong mineral scent. Running water. Subterranean rivers are common here. Some re-emerge as springs, others vanish into sinkholes. Against Edmund's caution, they pressed on. So tight was the throat that they shed coats, crawling on cold stone. Their lamps made the walls seem to breathe, distance warping in shadow. The roar grew, water, echoing through rock. When they spilled into the third chamber, the spectacle was beautiful and terrifying. A black river split the cavern, swift and deep, carving its channel from stone. The chamber vaulted away into dark. Colossal stalactites draped like curtains. The water's voice became a deafening chorus of reverberations. But it wasn't the river that stole their breath. Across the water, in the fringes of their beams, stood something not natural. Low walls of stacked stones enclosing a rectangular space. Inside, shapes that clenched the stomach, human once, but time and cave air had changed them into nearly unrecognizable forms. Joseph, practiced underground, took stock. The river was too deep and fast to swim, no bridge. But higher up, where the chamber narrowed, large rocks formed an irregular crossing. It would be perilous. The stones were slick with constant damp. A slip would mean death, swept into unknown depths. Hargrove knew he had to see it up close. He couldn't go back and build a case on guesses and glimpses. He tested each step, easing onto the rocks. The others spaced out, careful not to weight any one stone. 15 minutes of nerves stretched thin. Any misstep, the river would take them. The noise swallowed words. They gestured only. On the far side, sweat soaked them despite the cold. Their hands shook, from fear as much as chill. Up close, the structure's macabre truth stood plain. The stone walls boxed an area roughly 3 by 4 meters. Inside lay what could only be called an illicit cemetery. No coffins, no headstones, but the remains of at least 7 people, arranged with disturbing care. Rotting garments still clung to some bones, marking different eras. Some clearly older. Personal items lay as offerings. Pocket watches, wallets, rings, medals, spectacles set where eyes once were. The pattern was ritual. Each body in the same pose, facing the same way, hands crossed over the chest, a grim parody of proper burial. Edmund swept his beam over the far wall and froze. He illuminated an inscription, old English letters chiseled deep. Here lie those the mountain claimed. May their souls feed the ancient roots. May their silence keep the sacred secrets. Guardians we are, guardians we remain, until other twins replace us. The carving was old, decades, maybe a century, implying Ruth and Ruby were only the newest in a line of twin keepers. Joseph examined the bones, reading trauma in break patterns, fractured skulls, heavy blows. Cracked ribs, violent force. Yet the bodies hadn't been dragged carelessly. On the contrary, they'd been arranged with a tender deliberation, like reverence twisted toward horror. Hargrove forced himself to catalogue every detail, spotting clothes that matched descriptions of the missing. A wool coat with brass buttons like Whitmore's, a leather vest from an itinerant smith who vanished in 1930, boots with distinctive marks found in old records. Then Edmund's light picked out something else, an opening masked behind a cluster of stalagmites. Unlike the other throats, this one showed tool work, edges widened by hand. Joseph inspected the scars. Old work, primitive tools, decades past. Whoever opened this had skill and patience. The opening was stoop man high. A draught carried a different odor, earth, decaying vegetation, hinting at a nearer tie to the surface. The men hesitated. They were already deep, far from the mouth, and every minute raised the risk of meeting the sisters. Edmund's instincts prickled. He argued they had enough. But William sensed they were at the brink, the final piece explaining not just recent crimes, but the long shadow behind them. They entered. The walls were smoothed by human effort, regular footholds chipped into steeper sections. The tunnel rose, contradicting the long descent. Joseph guessed it was an old access, widened by prospectors or earlier explorers. After 20 minutes climbing, the passage opened into a smaller room, fundamentally different. Not a natural grotto hung with formations, but a space carved from living rock, flatter walls, a uniform low roof, and unmistakable signs of recent prolonged occupation. Blankets rolled in a corner, metal pots on wall hooks. Wooden crates stacked with provisions. A rough plank table held melted candles, more leather journals, and a scatter of objects collected over years. The walls were dense with drawings and writing, layers upon layers, a visual record of obsession and rite. William opened the books. Older here, some so worn the covers flaked at a touch. The first page of one read, 1873, 59 years prior. Elegant penmanship. 19th century schooling. It began. My sister and I came to these mountains following the whispers of blood. Mother taught us before her death, as her mother taught her, back to times long forgotten. We are guardians. This is our solemn burden. Other diaries echoed the theme, different names, different years, each pair of twins telling the same central story. Chosen at birth. Sworn to protect an ancient secret of the mountain, taught that certain travelers must be taken to sacred places where the mountain claims them. The details varied. The core never changed. There were mentions of old compacts, promises predating settlers, duties inherited from the first peoples. Edmund drew their eyes to a wall. Among the scrawls was a more deliberate panel, a careful piece. A lineage but drawn uniquely, descending, not branching, each generation marked by 2 linked circles, twins. At the top, not names but symbols, concepts or titles rather than English. Lower down, the symbols give way to names, Sarah and Susan, Martha and Mary, Elizabeth and Eleanor, and so on, ending in fresher ink, Ruth and Ruby. Joseph counted the pairs, 17 generations. If each spanned around 30 years, that's roughly 5 centuries. That would put its origin before European settlement, perhaps rooted in indigenous practice, later mingled with settler beliefs. Hargrove realized he faced something larger than simple murder. This was a tradition, a family cult, surviving centuries of upheaval, adapting through wars and social change. The twins weren't just criminals. They were practitioners of a faith they believed sacred, duty above human law. But motive didn't change outcome. Men were dead. Families left with holes that never healed. Whatever its age or sincerity, the practice was homicide. William's duty was plain: arrest them, try them, stop the blood. But he knew it wouldn't be easy. They would not surrender a purpose they believed older than law. Edmund suddenly signaled silence. He'd caught what the others missed. Faint movement in the entry tunnel, measured steps, familiar with the stone. Someone was coming, someone who knew these passages and walked them like a home. The 4 killed their lamps. The room fell nearly black. A faint glow grew from the passage. Voices, 2 women braiding through the stone. Words indistinct at first, then clearer as the light approached. The men held to the deepest shadows, hands on weapons, reluctant to fire blind in a sanctuary that belonged to the twins. The glow brightened. Now the words came, Ruth and Ruby talking about medicinal plants they'd gathered, a deer by the stream, and how autumn seemed early. They entered with oil lanterns, yellow light flickering. They stopped, sensing intrusion immediately. Ruth pointed at the table, candles set differently. Ruby swept the dark with slow, searching eyes, like she could see through shadow. Hargrove knew hiding was pointless. He snapped on his lamp and stepped into view. The twins didn't flinch, no shock, no fear, only a calm acceptance, as if they'd always known this hour would arrive. They set their lanterns down, stood shoulder to shoulder, identical and composed, awaiting what followed. The sheriff spoke first, his voice rebounding off rock. He told them he knew. The evidence, the bodies, the books. They would return with him and face justice. The twins exchanged a look, silent words passing between them. Ruby answered, soft, polite. She said they didn't understand, couldn't understand because they didn't carry guardian blood. These mountains are older than any lawmen drafted in distant rooms, she said. Pacts were sworn when the world was young, agreements between land and people, promises that outlive generations. Ruth added they hadn't chosen this path. Refusing it would bring calamity on everyone who lived in these hills. Hargrove listened, disbelief mingling with an ache he didn't expect. He was a practical man, shaped by war and hard years. Yet their conviction rang true in a disturbing way. They weren't raving nor split from reality like others he'd arrested. Their eyes held a steady clarity, an unshakable certainty that made it all the more unsettling. Edmund and the miners stayed taut, ready if the twins bolted or struck, but Ruth and Ruby offered no fight. They seemed resigned, though unconvinced of the authority that bound them. Ruby continued, patient as a teacher with students not yet ready. The first guardian, whose true name was lost, had been of the native people long before settlers arrived. She bore twins in a brutal winter when the tribe starved. Desperate, she carried them into the sacred caves, places where elders said the mountain spirits lived. There, according to the legend carried forward, she forged a pact. Her daughters, and all twins after, would keep the mountain's secrets, hold balance between the living and the underworld. In return, the tribe would endure. Ruth picked up the thread. When settlers came, with new sickness and conflict, the native peoples were scattered or destroyed. But one guardian married a settler who respected the old ways. He accepted that his twin daughters would carry the mantle. Across centuries, the line persisted, sometimes through native blood, sometimes through settler families, but always the same core vow. William asked plainly about the men who died, Whitmore, Peton, and the rest in that burial chamber. Why those men? What marked their fate? Another glance passed between the sisters. Ruby said they did not choose haphazardly. Signs existed, taught since childhood, passed from mother to daughter. Certain travelers bore an invisible mark, something only guardians could sense, not physical, rather a presence, a resonance with the mountain, signaling they were destined to become part of the place. Ruth added, "The mountain chose." They were intermediaries, priestesses of something older than any church. Joseph, silent until now, spoke. He'd worked underground all his life, never saw spirits, never felt forces demanding blood. To him, this was superstition sustained by indoctrination, an ancient lie consuming each generation of twins. His words struck Ruth harder than the sheriff's charge. She stepped forward, eyes keen in the lamplight, the first true emotion since discovery, anger braided with frustration. "Men like him," she said, "who blasted coal from the earth without reverence, were the reason guardians were needed. Modern mines had harmed the mountain. Every blast and tunnel without proper rights tore rents not only in stone but in the place's essence." Ruby calmed her with a hand, then spoke more gently. They didn't expect modern lawmen to understand. They would come peacefully. They would face judgment. But it wouldn't change the truth. More twins would be born, as always, because guardian blood flowed in more families than anyone guessed, waiting through the years until another pair arrived to take the charge. Hargrove knew he needed them out before things turned. He set Edmund and the miners to watch as he bound the twins' hands with rope. Ruth and Ruby yielded, composed as ever, as if in their minds the larger arc was beyond this moment. The way back through the cave ran long and tense. The twins led them with efficient grace, calling out loose stones, warning of low roofs, pointing the safest routes. It was almost ironic, the prisoners guiding captors through their own sanctuary. They stepped into daylight at last. Sun low, sky stained orange and red, mountains seemingly ablaze. After the damp dark, the air and light felt like another world. Ruth and Ruby stood silent, gazing over their mountains, as if bidding farewell to something larger than themselves. The two deputies at the mouth gaped as the sheriff emerged with his bound prisoners. William ordered camp set there, the hour too late to start for town. They built fires, shared food, posted watches. The twins were kept together, still tied, but given blankets and equal rations. In the night, while most slept, William lay awake watching them. They lay close, nearly one shape under the blankets, whispering beyond his hearing. It was deeply human. Two sisters comforting each other under a hard future. For the first time, he wondered if the justice ahead was as simple as he'd decided. Then he remembered the bodies, the journals, the years of vanished men. Whatever the twins believed, the end was the same, suffering and death. That he could not abide, no matter how ancient the rite or sincere the belief. Morning brought a dense fog, white gauze across the ridges, visibility cut to yards. They packed for the trek back, securing the twins but not tormenting them. Ruth and Ruby accepted it with that same calm, as if stepping through a ritual already written into the rock. Edmund stayed keenly alert. He knew the mountain like no one else save the twins, and knew a dozen places ripe for an ambush. Not that he expected accomplices, but their serenity unnerved him, as if events moved under a plan he couldn't see. The return took 2 full days. They spent the second night by a stream, its constant murmur both soothing and uneasy. The twins remained inseparable, sitting together even while eating or under. Discreet supervision for private needs, William noticed they spoke less now, communicating, with glances and tiny gestures that felt beyond ordinary sisterhood. Reaching Welch, the county seat, set off a commotion. News traveled slow, but rumors about the twins had simmered for years. Seeing them led in by Sheriff Hargrove confirmed what many had only dared whisper. People flooded the street, some with rough satisfaction, others with rubberneck curiosity, a few with pity or fear. The sheriff took them to the brick station that doubled as courthouse. Only 3 cells. He locked Ruth and Ruby together in the largest, knowing separation would be cruel and likely pointless. He posted guards and barred visitors until he could prepare for court. The next days were a whirlwind. Hargrove spent hours assembling evidence, cataloging diaries, listing identifiable victims, and preparing what he'd hand the district attorney. Edmund and the miners gave detailed statements as a clerk scribbled hard to keep up. Underground chambers, macabre altars, ancestral rites like waking nightmares. The county prosecutor, Howard Mitchell, came from Charleston after urgent telegrams. Known for method, for taking no case to trial without bedrock prep. When he surveyed Hargrove's pile, even he looked shaken. It was the most extraordinary case in 20 years. Mitchell spent 2 weeks combing every strand, interviewing witnesses, consulting document experts, even bringing in an anthropologist from Charleston to assess claims of indigenous tradition and ancestral pacts. The scholar, Dr. Samuel Hewitt, was fascinated but careful, acknowledging cultural precedents for ritual practice while stressing nothing could excuse murder in modern law. Meanwhile, Ruth and Ruby sat in their cell, fed and treated properly, yet marble quiet. They answered when asked, but little more. Guards reported they sat for hours, hands joined, gazing through the small window at the far mountains that had been theirs. In the 3rd week, something strange happened. A night guard, Peter Welch, fell suddenly ill. High fevers, delirium, muttering about voices from the hills, broken promises, balances to be restored. The doctor found no cause. The illness lifted as abruptly after 3 days. Peter refused further duty at the jail, said the building filled him with dread. Superstitious townsfolk whispered the twins had powers, that they cursed those who kept them, that the mountains were angry at broken traditions. Hargrove swatted down the talk. But in places where folklore runs in the water, reason doesn't always carry. The trial was set for early November 1933. Mitchell pursued first-degree murder in 5 cases with the strongest evidence: Whitmore, Peton, and 3 more travelers whose effects were clearly identified from the cave. Older or thinner cases would be tried later if convictions came first. Finding an impartial jury was almost impossible. Everyone had heard the rumors. The judge, Thaddeus Blackwood, a seasoned hand, summoned jurors from neighboring counties, men with less emotional stake, in theory able to weigh only facts. The first day packed the small courtroom and overflowed the street. Reporters arrived from Charleston and beyond, drawn by the fusion of violence with folklore and ancient tradition. When Ruth and Ruby were led in, the room fell to a hush. They wore simple, clean dresses from the county, faces serene, distant. Over 3 days, Mitchell laid out his case, reading diary excerpts, presenting personal effects from the caves, calling witnesses who identified those objects as belonging to the missing. Edmund testified he saw the twins with Whitmore, near Raven Rock. The miners described the burial chamber and the carefully arranged remains. The court appointed a defender, Charles Donovan, mostly a civil lawyer, plainly out of depth but doing all he could. He argued the case was circumstantial, no one saw an act. Bodies could have reached the cave otherwise. But when Mitchell asked whether the defense would call the accused to testify, the ground shifted. They had the right to remain silent. If they spoke, they'd be under oath. After a recess and brief counsel, Donovan announced, yes, they would testify. The room buzzed. Judge Blackwood hammered it quiet. Ruth took the stand first, moving with a composed grace, hands folded in her lap, eyes steady on Mitchell as he approached. Something in her look made the seasoned prosecutor hesitate before he began. The room was so quiet a fly hitting a pane sounded loud. Mitchell started basic, identity, residence, then pushed deeper. Ruth answered plainly, firmly, no dodging. Did she know Whitmore? Yes. Did she and her sister speak with him near Raven Rock? Yes. Did they invite him to a special place? Yes. The candor stunned Mitchell. He'd braced for denials. Instead, Ruth confirmed the facts with disarming honesty. What happened next? Ruth said they led him along guardian paths to the cave on Pinnacle. She described the underground wonders, the millennia-old formations. He marveled, scribbling notes, asking geology questions. But when they reached the chamber beyond the river, when he saw the stone structure, the arranged remains, his awe turned to horror. He tried to flee, but the passages confound the uninitiated. In the near total dark, he lost himself. The sisters followed, not hurried, but patient. At last, he was cornered in a narrow throat. "There," Ruth said, voice eerily calm. The pact was fulfilled. She spared graphic detail, made it clear it was quick, and he did not suffer needlessly. The courtroom shuddered. Murmurs rippled. The judge pounded for order. Mitchell, regaining his footing, pressed. Why Whitmore? What marked him? Ruth said it was something felt, hard to render in ordinary words. Certain people gave off a resonance, as if their souls called to the deep earth. Some are between worlds, not fully belonging to the noisy modern surface, destined to become part of the old mountains. Guardians recognize them and help them finish that journey, even if the chosen can't comprehend it. Mitchell asked about the others, Peton and Moore. Ruth confirmed each, enough detail to erase doubt, speaking of them with a strange reverence, like willing participants in sacred rites rather than victims lured to death. When the defense finally rose, Donovan tried to frame Ruth as indoctrinated from infancy, genuinely believing herself bound by sacred duty, less culpable therefore. Ruth listened, then answered in ways that didn't aid that angle. She understood human law considered her acts crimes. There were, she said, older laws she chose to obey. Asked if she felt remorse, she finally showed an emotion besides serenity. Looking straight at the jury, eyes bright, she said she felt sadness at the necessity that each life weighed on them, but remorse, meaning belief they'd done wrong. No, she believed she had done what must be done. Ruby followed, and her testimony mirrored Ruth's almost note for note. Same story, slight shifts in emphasis, the same unearthly composure. When pressed for remorse, she replied that ordinary feelings didn't apply to duties beyond the individual. Their testimony sealed their fate more surely than any exhibit. Judge Blackwood instructed the jury on evidence, sanity, responsibility, and why religious belief is no shield for murder. Deliberations took under 4 hours. On a cold November afternoon, the foreman, a middle-aged farmer, stood and without triumph delivered the verdict. Guilty of first-degree murder on all 5 counts. The crowd fractured, some applauded, others sat stunned. A few wept, for reasons even they couldn't name. Ruth and Ruby took the verdict without flicker, hands clasped, eyes on the distant window where the mountains stood under a gray sky. The judge set sentencing for the following week to review papers and any mitigating pleas. During that week, strange reports spread. Animals acting erratically, birds wheeling in chaotic patterns, people dreaming of the mountains calling, ancient voices rumbling in the earth. Hargrove dismissed it as mass suggestion, the natural outcome of a sensational case. Edmund wasn't so sure. He'd lived by these hills all his life. He sensed a tension he couldn't quantify. He told the sheriff the night before sentencing, William held to the law over superstition. Sentencing day drew an even larger crowd. Judge Blackwood entered grave-faced, aware this decision would echo for generations. He spoke of justice, how a society must rest on written law, not tribal rights or mystic belief. He acknowledged the defendant's sincerity, but stressed sincerity doesn't absolve responsibility. He adjusted his spectacles and read the sentence, his voice solemn, resonant in the wooden room. He recapped each case, evidence, testimony, and confessions, his tone carrying legal weight and quiet sorrow. Recognizing the case exceeded ordinary categories after 25 years on the bench. The sentence, death by hanging, as West Virginia law prescribed for first-degree murder. The date, December 15, 1933, about a month after the verdict, time for automatic appeals and final procedure. When the gavel fell, Ruth and Ruby finally showed a crack in their poise. They turned and clutched each other fiercely. For the first time since capture, silent tears traced their identical faces. Escorting them back, Hargrove felt a pang, doubt or compassion he couldn't say. They were 18, terrible acts aside, there was a profound tragedy here. They hadn't chosen to be born twins into a lineage steeped in a macabre tradition. From earliest memory, a path had been laid that led straight to this end. Appeals followed. Donovan argued temporary insanity, lifelong indoctrination, and even technical points about ancient crimes and prosecution. All failed. Confessions were too explicit. Understanding too clear. The physical evidence too heavy to allow ambiguity. Religious voices argued both sides, some pleading clemency and redemption, others insisting the sentence stand as a message against pagan rites and blood guilt. The case spilled beyond McDowell County. National papers, from New York to San Francisco, published pieces on mountain cults, ancestral vows, and the bounds of responsibility versus cultural conditioning. Dr. Hewitt published an academic analysis, comparing elements across native traditions, the idea of sacred places, spiritual territories, arguing that while the acts were crimes, they reflected a rare persistence of culture through centuries of upheaval. His work stirred debate. Some accused him of romanticizing homicide. In their cell, Ruth and Ruby spent their remaining days in quiet reflection. Allowed paper and ink, they wrote extensively, recording their experiences and every scrap of teaching. From mother and grandmother, these writings were seized as evidence and sealed in county records, unopened except to approved researchers for decades. Their mother, Sarah, visited once, 30 minutes under watch. Witnesses said she wept the entire time, clutching her daughters through steel, whispering words no one else could hear. She emerged looking years older and died 3 months later. The certificate read, pneumonia. Many said heartbreak. Their father, a miner who'd spent his life deep underground, never came. He left McDowell County after the verdict. Another state, a new name. Some claimed he'd always known and looked away. Others believed Sarah kept the secret until initiation. Edmund visited the twins a week before the end, seeking perhaps closure. They received him with their strangely warm courtesy, as if hosting a guest. He asked if they feared death. Ruby said they did not, that there was relief in returning to the guardians who came before, that their souls would go back to the mountains they loved. Ruth added something that chilled him. Other twins were already born somewhere in those hills. Maybe infants, maybe not yet aware. But guardian blood waits as long as it takes. In the last nights before the execution, Hargrove pored over files, hunting for anything. Missed any trace of others or more victims. He found references in older journals to a place called the First Sanctuary, distinct from the chambers they'd seen, the site of the original pact. No directions. With Ruth and Ruby's execution imminent, that knowledge would die. The night before the hanging, a brutal storm clawed the mountains. Wind tore branches. Thunder banged like ancient war drums. Lightning burned the sky. Older folks swore they hadn't seen its like in 50 years. Power failed at the station. Oil lamps returned, throwing dancing shadows along the walls. 19th century light in 1933. Ruth and Ruby stayed awake, side by side, on the narrow bed, singing quietly a song no one knew. The words weren't English, perhaps not any living tongue, but the melody had a haunting, sorrowed pull that made the guards ache. One, Thomas Green, a devout man, later swore that during the chant, the station's walls faded and he saw ancient hills beneath dim stars. Dawn came. The storm passed. Sky cleaned to a hard, bright blue. The air so clear, the mountains looked only steps away. December 15th, 1933, broke cold and still, as if even the birds knew something heavy was at hand. The execution was set for 10 a.m. in the courthouse yard, wooden scaffold built for the purpose. People gathered early, drawn from every corner of McDowell and beyond. Some from morbid curiosity, some for justice, some for reasons they couldn't name. Hargrove placed a ring of deputies around the platform, ready to hold order, though no one expected a rescue. At 9:45, they brought the twins out. They wore plain grey cotton dresses. Their hair braided identically to the shoulder, hands bound before them, they walked with steady dignity. Their faces held that same serene resignation. Seeing the twin ropes sway gently in the cold breeze did not draw fear to their faces, only acceptance. The local Reverend, Joshua Winters, offered prayers and a last chance at confession and repentance. They listened. Then Ruby, soft but firm, said they had offered their prayers to the powers they recognized. Their spirits were at peace. They needed no forgiveness from a God brought by colonizers. The Reverend recoiled, signing the cross as if pushing away a presence. The hangman was brought in from Charleston, no ties to locals, a professional who promised a quick end. He checked ropes, adjusted knots, set the black hoods. His movements methodical, impersonal. Just a job, though he later admitted this one would haunt him. At 10 sharp, Judge Blackwood read the final sentence to the crowd. He restated the crimes, the verdict, and that all remedies were exhausted. Then, per protocol, he asked the condemned for final words. Silence hung. Wind rustled branches. The crowd shuffled. Ruth stepped as far as her bonds allowed. She looked past the judge, past the onlookers, to the far mountains, peaks tipped with early winter snow. When she spoke, her voice was clear, almost musical. She said the mountains are eternal. Civilizations rise and fall. Men's laws turn to dust. Stone remembers. She said other guardians would come, as they always had, because the pact ran deeper than memory, older than death. Ruby's voice followed, an echo so perfect it sounded like one voice in two bodies. They held no grudge against judge or jury, each followed their truths. But she warned, remove a cornerstone from an arch, and though the structure may stand a while, it will begin to fail in ways no one foresees. Her words felt prophetic. The crowd shifted uneasily. Then, unexpected, the sisters began to sing, the same ageless melody, their voices braided perfectly. Harmony that raised gooseflesh and drew tears without reason. The song continued as the hoods went on, as the nooses were settled, as the final checks finished. Hargrove stood beside the scaffold, his face tight over a storm inside. He'd spent months on the case, through treacherous caverns, assembling unanswerable proof. He believed in law, in order, in consequences. And yet, as he watched these two young women, he couldn't shake the sense that something vital was being lost. Some knowledge modern hearts no longer hold. The hangman gripped the lever. Judge Blackwood nodded. The twins' song rose, one high, sustained note that seemed to tremble the very air. Then the lever fell. The doors yawned open. Ruth and Ruby dropped together. Silence took the yard, thick, suffocating. The bodies swayed. The last movement stilled. After 5 minutes, the doctor ascended, checked pulses, declared death at 7 minutes and 10 seconds. Even then, many later swore they still heard it, the far-off echo of that song, from the mountains themselves, as if the stone had learned the melody and refused to let it die. They were buried in an obscure corner of the county cemetery, no markers beyond 2 plain wooden crosses with names and dates. Officials hoped to avoid any pilgrimage or shrine. Yet within weeks, people noticed wildflowers blooming over the graves, varieties not native to the area, and no one claimed to have planted them. Hargrove stayed sheriff another 12 years, retired in 1945 after the war. He never spoke publicly about the twins, refused interviews. But Edmund, his lifelong friend, said, William sometimes returned alone to Pinnacle's caves, perhaps seeking understanding or a closure the law couldn't deliver. Edmund kept hunting the high country into old age, but he never re-entered that system of caverns. He said it had changed, that even a man without superstition could feel the threshold bristle. Others said the same, and that tract of Mount Pinnacle became informally off-limits, avoided without signs or fences. In the years after, rumors still rose, new disappearances in the Appalachians, travelers on foot who simply never came back. Some had ordinary explanations, getting lost, exposure, or an intentional vanishing act. Some did not, bearing patterns old-timers recognized, raising the question Ruth and Ruby posed. Had other guardians already stepped into their place? The diaries and artifacts taken from the caves stayed sealed in county archives, opened only in the 1980s for academic review, reigniting interest among anthropologists, historians, folklorists, captivated by that blend of indigenous belief, settler religion, and extreme isolation that forged this singular family cult. But many answers stayed buried because crucial knowledge died with Ruth and Ruby on that cold December morning. The Appalachians rise as ever, indifferent to human drama. Their caves still hold undiscovered depths. Their forests still whisper in tongues few living understand, and on certain still nights when the wind pours from a particular quarter, folks around Mount Pinnacle swear they hear something like distant singing, two matched voices, twined in an ancient melody that makes the heart yearn for something it never knew it lost. The tale of Ruth and Ruby, the Appalachian, twins too unsettling for the history books to tell. Straight remains a stark reminder that human experience has more layers than our comfortable categories of right and wrong can hold. They were killers. That's undeniable. But they were also the last keepers of a tradition reaching centuries back, believers in a system that made sense to countless generations before ours. Justice, as men write it, was done, whether that brought closure or simply buried questions we prefer not to face, remains an open matter even now. If this passage through one of the darkest cases in the West Virginia Highlands stayed with you, if it made you weigh tradition, justice, and the land's secrets, consider subscribing to The Other Door. There are many more stories waiting, mysteries buried by time, deserving to be examined with careful inquiry and respect for human complexity. Leave a like if this story stirred reflections beyond mere entertainment, and share in the comments your perspective on where we should draw the line between honoring ancestral rights and upholding modern justice. Until next time, step with care into the shadows of the mountains and listen closely to what they choose to sing.